C'è un countdown, mancano 20 secondi, direi che a questo punto possiamo
20 seconds to go.
cominciare. Buonasera.
Well, let us start with
Benvenuti
this
a questo
talk.
incontro.
Welcome you all, and
Un'occasione
welcome again.
credo molto interessante e significativa.
I believe we're going to have a very important lecture.
Meglio di me quanto
As you know,
monetario internazionale sia
the International Monetary Fund is indeed one of the key players
giorni in queste ore
at this very time, in these very days, in terms of the Greek issue. James Boughton
signore che
is
ha
a gentleman
lavorato
who's
per
worked
più di 30
for
anni
over 30 years at the International Monetary Fund. He's the senior fellow of the Center for International Governance and Innovation in Canada, an organization that has contributed to this meeting as well.
ma fino al 2012
Up until 2012,
carriera di successo di studio
he's had a successful career at the International Monetary Fund. So he's worked for 20 years, from 1922 to 2012,
a ricoprire il ruolo di
devoted to playing as the active historian of the fund. And that led to the publishing of two important books devoted to two key times in the history of this institution. The first book is A Silent Revolution,
che copre gli anni di attività
covering the
sulla scena economica globale
years of the International Monetary Fund between 1979 through 1989, and then the following decade that was the object of another publication, tearing down the walls of the International Monetary Fund at the time of the collapse of the Berlin Wall.
molti di voi sapranno come è nato.
Many of you probably know how the International Monetary Fund was incorporated at the end of the Second World War, thanks to the agreement that had been reached in a place in New Hampshire, Bretton Woods, in 1944. That was the release of political determination to put an end to a time of upheaval and disruption, not only in terms of wars, but also in terms of economic disruption. And the decision probably finds its roots some decade earlier than that. So the fund has taken up a challenge many years away from the incorporation. The International Monetary Fund is still extremely topical in managing capital market, which is very open, which is based on the free movement of goods and people, a world that is still divided up in the different nation states. The nation states are the ones that are still legitimate by the vote, so the prerogatives are always going to be different from state to state. It seemed a very difficult challenge in 1944 when most of the world were suffering the end of the war. The war was not even over then, and it is still a very difficult task for the International Monetary Fund now. As is well known to many, the Bretton Woods Agreement that guided the world for many years were based on the converging and competitive action of American Dexter White and John Maynard Keynes, the British economist that perhaps is the main inspirator of many main players also at this festival. Indeed, there are many people here at the festival that were pro the action of the public authorities. Dexter White was for the adoption of a financial institution to ratify, and then the statute, the bylaws, was signed in 1945. The losers of the war, Italy, Germany and Japan, were out of that, but we were included. Italy was the first to be included, thanks to the role that Italy had played during the war, at the end of the war, more specifically against Nazi Germany. So belonging to the International Monetary Fund owes it also to our partisans fighting in the mountains, perhaps. And this is perhaps a bit of an irony. Many of the communist partisans probably wouldn't have appreciated the result of their action. A long history started some 70 years ago. During 70 years, the fund has promoted mutual consistency among the monetary policies of the different member countries and the stability of the international monetary situation, to promote economic growth against the general background of stability. 70 years, a very long time. During this time, the world has changed dramatically more than once. The history of the International Monetary Fund crosses the Cold War and the time of the golden age in capitalism that was often quoted by Thomas Piketty and Professor Stiglitz. Those 30 years that were characterized by a strong growth in manufacturing, strong growth of income, strong growth and development of quality of life for the overwhelming majority of population. So very positively looked upon by those who have the well-being of population at heart. The social mobility was not just wishful thinking, but was something that was really true, as all fathers could expect their children to have a better lives than themselves. And this is very much the history of our own families that dated to those 30 years. Many are still living based on what had been done during those 30 years in the 20th century. But during the silent revolution years, at the time of the regulation of markets, with the attitude of Reagan and Thatcher, still the International Monetary Fund again stuck to its role as the champion of stability. Then at the end of 2007, we had the financial crisis, whose effects are still deeply felt, especially on this side of the Atlantic. Throughout this extraordinary development, throughout these years of the history of the world, where countries have become increasingly intertwined, we still believe that the politics is very much connected to national states, but the interdependence of national states is still a truism. But in the International Monetary Fund, has always stuck to its bylaws throughout, so much so that a gentleman working at the radio where I work, at Radio 3, calling up our program and commenting on the situation in Greece, said, well, the United Nations are over, they cannot act, they cannot be effective at all. Just look at what is happening with Syria. The only institution which is truly international, which really has a bearing on facts for the good or evil, according to the different points of sight, is indeed the International Monetary Fund. Well, perhaps that gentleman at the radio was overdoing it a bit. Well, it will be interesting to understand what Mr. James BOUGHTON thinks about that. Well, the action that has been carried out by the International Monetary Fund is based on loans to be granted to countries to make them stable, especially the borrowers. Well, that is based on two basic concepts, i.e. conditionality and ownership. The first means the need for individual government borrowers to correct their economic policies. Those are to be assessed on a regular basis by experts of the International Monetary Fund, and objectives are to be reached in agreement with the experts of the IMF. Those conditions, again, are prerequisite to obtain such loans. So we'll see what is about to happen now in Greece. Anyway, those conditions are requirements, and those loans obviously do not cover all the need for financing of a little country, but just the minimum part. As for the rest, they act as guarantees so that this money can reassure potential investors and guide further investments towards that country by public authorities or private funds. Conditionality is one key word, and ownership is the second one. The need for individual for individual countries to own the reform plans as agreed upon with the IMF. And this is a process of ownership which is very sensitive. It requires also a close relationship of borrowers with their public, with the voters. I think, for example, about the dramatic situation of the Greek government faced with the promises they've made during the campaign that led Tsipras again to be appointed as a prime minister in that country. The case of Greece, the austerity measures that were taken, the impoverishment of the most vulnerable that many are referring to and that is widely recognized, well, all that led to the consolidation of an opinion that perhaps existed even before the Greek case. The IMF has promoted not only the poorer countries by means of the heavily criticized program of structural adjustment that were imposed as conditionality to many poor countries in Africa, Latin America and elsewhere, even in Europe at a time of crisis, and that has promoted rigor and austerity in the public expenditure on the one side and privatization and deregulation of the market on the other side. So much so that, and this is what the critics of the fund say, apparently this has contributed to make the stronger elements stronger and the weaker even weaker, even more weak. This certainly was not the objective of the experts of the fund, but this indeed apparently is one of the results of the action of the fund on in different areas. And this is why I believe that this lecture is going to be so important. I'm about to leave him the floor. I believe that there are many people in the country, Professor Bolton, that firmly believe, sometimes with rage, that the IMF, despite being an agency that was set up to fight against inequalities worldwide and as a guarantor of international financial stability, in the end did the opposite of promoting inequalities. Well, I'm very curious and eager to listen to your lecture. I know that this opinion is widely maintained in many countries by many people. So over to you, Professor Bolton.
Okay, Pietro, thank you very much. It's really a delight to be here. I've been listening to many very interesting presentations over the last few days, as I'm sure all of you have. And I think what we've learned, if we needed to learn it, is that that's the lack of social mobility, the persistence and even growth of inequality in the world, inequality both of income and wealth, is a huge problem. And I think, Pietro, I think you're absolutely right that if you took a survey, probably of people in this room, certainly of people generally, as to whether the IMF was part of the solution to that or whether it was part of the problem, you'd probably find a big majority in people who think that the IMF is part of the problem. So I'm not here to defend the fund. I'm here. I always took my job as historian of the IMF as not to defend the fund, but to explain the fund and to try to understand where the fund was coming from when it undertook to try to solve certain problems. And I'll try to do that in the next 40 minutes or so on this specific topic about whether the IMF can reduce global inequality. So certainly when I posed this question as a topic, even some of my former colleagues at the IMF sort of looked at me very strangely and thought, that's a dumb question. Of course the IMF cannot do anything to reduce global inequality. But I don't think it's true. And I certainly don't think it's true that the IMF has to be part of the problem. Because in my view, there is no long-run trade-off between financial stability and high-quality growth that's sustainable and that promotes employment and good outcomes for the population as a whole. Those are not incompatible goals. In fact, they are very compatible goals, that you cannot have financial stability unless you also have good, sustainable growth in the economy. If you don't have good, sustainable growth, then the pressures on the financial system will be great. And if you don't have financial stability, by the same token, you can't sustain good growth. So you have to have both. And I think it's really just a matter of trying to make sure that everybody understands that. Now, there is a short-term problem. If you start off in an economy, in a country that is stuck in a bad equilibrium, then getting from a bad equilibrium to a good equilibrium very likely involves a trade-off. if you want to try to reduce poverty in an economy, that probably involves more public spending. But if you want to reestablish financial stability in the economy, that may very well involve less public spending. So you've got a trade-off, but it's a short-term trade-off. It's a question of timing. How much time can you buy to get from your bad equilibrium to your good equilibrium? And if you do that job well, then there's no necessary problem. So I'm going to try to make 4 basic points in this talk this afternoon. The first point I need to make is that the IMF has, in fact, committed itself publicly over and over again to reducing poverty and inequality in the world. That is a stated major goal of the IMF. Secondly, I want to show that although the IMF is not formally an aid agency, it's not like the World Bank, it's not like some UN agencies and so on. It's not an aid agency, but it does have some important tools that should enable it to help countries deal with inequality and poverty. And the third point I want to make is that the IMF has, in fact, had some success along those lines. It's not all bad stories about the IMF, despite what you may have heard. But fourth one, and this is the most important point because we have to be forward-looking here and have a positive outcome to this afternoon, is that the IMF can do better and it should do better. And I want to say a few words at the end of the talk about what it might take for the IMF to do better. Okay, so that's what I'm trying to do here. So let's go back to the Bretton Woods conference in the 1940s that Pietro mentioned in his introduction. This was a catchphrase in the Franklin Roosevelt administration during World War II, that prosperity, like peace, is indivisible. You cannot have one country be rich and the other countries be poor, because that's a totally unsustainable position in the world. Now, that was a very controversial statement, but it was repeated over and over again, and it was first articulated by Harry Dexter White, who led the effort within the U.S. Treasury to establish the IMF. In fact, he made the link between that and the IMF very clear in his original 1942 proposal for an institution that eventually became the International Monetary Fund. He said, why do we need the IMF? We need the IMF because the United States does not intend to desert the war-torn and impoverished nations after the war is won. Now, that's a high-sounding phrase, but it was not altruism on the part of the United States. Harry Dexter White and his colleagues in the U.S. Treasury understood very clearly that the U.S. Had become a very rich country, certainly relative to the rest of the world, because it held 3/4 of the world's gold reserves. It held the only reserve currency in the world. It accounted for the majority of international trade. But if it was going to prosper after the war, it had to have markets out there. It had to have other prospering countries to trade with and to share finance with. So that was his view. It was an enlightened view, but it was an enlightened view based on self-interest. But that was very much the rationale for creating the International Monetary Fund in 1944. Now let me fast forward to 1990, because I'll come back to the early days in a few minutes. But it was in 1990 that the fund really began to accept an explicit commitment to try to deal with poverty and inequality. And so I brought up this for your consideration, this quotation from Michel Comdessous, who was the managing director of the IMF from 1987 to the year 2000. And in a speech in 1990, he said that the IMF was striving to improve the design of our programs. In other words, recognizing that all had not been sweetness and light between the IMF and poor countries up to that point. But he said, we're striving to improve the design of our programs to ensure that the plight of the poor is properly recognized. So that was kind of an eye-opener for a lot of people. You know, why is the IMF being concerned with this? But he did a lot of things that I'll say about in a few minutes during the 1990s to try to make this happen. And then I've got another quotation here from Trevor Manuel. Trevor Manuel was finance minister in South Africa under Nelson Mandela. And he was also the chairman of the ministerial committee for the IMF in the late 1990s. And in a speech to the ministerial committee, making the case for trying to do more of what Michel Camdessus had been talking about, Trevor Manuel said, I see the thrust of the IMF's role in two major directions. Now, the first major direction was what you all think of, and we all think of, as the primary role of the IMF, is to ensure the smooth functioning of the international financial system and avoid financial crisis. But there's a second arrow in the quiver here, a second direction in which the IMF needs to work, and that is, in Manuel's words, to assist low-income countries in fighting poverty and in integrating into the world economy. Now, of course, Trevor Manuel was speaking as the representative of a low-income country himself, becoming an emerging market, but still with many problems of poverty to deal with. But he was making this case to the world community in the context of this body, and insisting that this has to be a major part. So I have a number of other quotes here. I'll just throw these up on the board, but without saying much about them. Horst Köhler was the managing director after Michel Camdessus. He was from 2002 to 2004. And the interesting thing about Köhler is that he was continuing Camdessus' emphasis on poverty reduction as a goal for the IMF. He was from Germany. A lot of people thought he was just going to represent sort of the world of financial orthodoxy, but no, he said this is an important task that we need to continue, and we need to work with the countries to make this happen. We need to work with the World Bank. And then he went on. He was actually making this argument in a speech he made to a group of Catholic bishops. And so he made a plea for the Catholic Church to work with the IMF to try to make these things happen. So this idea of, we're all in this together. We all have the same goals. We're all trying to achieve something, and we need to work together to make this happen. His successor, Rodrigo Durato from Spain, made similar arguments. One of the most important areas of our work, he said, not just a secondary aspect of it, but one of the most important aspects that we do is to try to reduce poverty. And then perhaps the most famous managing director we've had in recent days, a tragic figure, Dominique Strauss-Kahn. But Dominique Strauss-Kahn had a very deep interest in sub-Saharan Africa, and he made a very strong case that as a result of the global financial crisis, which Pietro mentioned as a major function for the IMF right now, as a result of that crisis, that we're going to have 50 million people possibly being pushed into extreme poverty unless something was done about it. And we, the IMF, are going to work with the G20 to do something about it. And then this brings us up to the current managing director, Christine Lagarde, who's made other very similar kinds of comments here, that the IMF has to deal with this vast inequality in the world. 0.5% of the global population holds over 35% of the wealth. She sounds like Thomas Piketty here in saying that this is not sustainable. It's something that has to be solved, but it's something that the IMF itself is very interested in solving. And then she goes on to talk about the need for inclusive growth. A priority for the IMF has been protecting and augmenting social spending to reduce poverty and exclusion. So here's the point. If the IMF is not doing these things, then it's not doing its job. They cannot fall back and say, oh, no, we're just a financial stability agency and fighting poverty is the problem of the World Bank or somebody else. It's our problem. We have to deal with it. That's the message that has come out over and over again. Now, a lot of people have argued that this is just lip service. And there's a case to be made for this. I'm quoting here from a colleague of mine at CIGI, Besma Mamani, who's a professor of political science at the University of Waterloo in Canada. And she makes a very good point here. She said that the fund's organizational culture, the culture of the staff, the kind of people that work at the fund, that culture resists attempts to incorporate poverty reduction in its work objectives. So what Besma is worried about is that all these people up here at the top are acknowledging that this has to be the work of the fund. The people in the middle, people like me, who the job I used to have, are not doing that job, right? So, and there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, the IMF is full of macroeconomists who've been trained at Anglo-Saxon universities. They're interested in macro problems. They're not trained in micro problems. And when I was working on these issues in the fund's policy department 10, 15 years ago, I personally ran into the exact kind of resistance that she's talking about. It's mainly the old timers, people of my generation. It's not the people who are coming up through the fund now. So I think it is changing, but changing that culture has been a big challenge for the fund. But I think it is happening now. If we look beyond some of these generalities, there is strong evidence of progress. This is a quote from the fund's own independent evaluation office, which operates independently of the executive board and management and staff. And they did a study of whether the fund is actually helping in poverty. And they came up with kind of a bland, anodyne kind of comment, but it said the fund has made significant progress. Nevertheless, challenges remain. A nice half-full glass kind of pronouncement. So let's look elsewhere. Look outside. This group, New Rules for Global Finance, is a left-leaning, Washington-based think tank. They spent a lot of time assessing how the fund is done. And they came up with an interesting conclusion. They said that the IMF has made a marginally positive effect on reducing inequality. Now, that doesn't sound really like a ringing endorsement, but they looked at several different groups. They looked at the IMF, they looked at the Financial Stability Board, the World Bank, the OECD, the G20, and only the IMF and the Financial Stability Board got this ringing endorsement of making a marginally positive impact. The others were useless as far as trying to reduce poverty. So here's the task now, right? So we've got a glass that's half full. Progress is being made. People are making faint praise of the IMF. How do we get above a marginally positive outcome? How do we get better? So to do that, you need to go back a little bit. And what I've tried to identify, and I'll lay them out very quickly for you here, is a set of 4 stages that the IMF has gone through to get where it is today, or what I'll call 4 models that the IMF has tried over the 70-odd years that it's been in existence. The original model was to focus only on macroeconomics. As Pedro said, all this is starting out at the end of World War II. And you've got all these ruined economies around the world. And so the task is to restart global finance and restart global economics. And that's going to be a really tough task. And it was such a hard task that you could focus on the big things. You didn't need to worry about the nuances very much. And if you could do something about the big things, you could help everybody. That was the idea. Sort of rising tide lifts all boats, in the popular phrase. Now, you can only get so far with that, but that was the initial idea. So it's focusing only on macroeconomics, but we did in fact find, and Piketty himself has has presented a lot of data showing this, how inequality was declining pretty rapidly during the first 30 years or so, 25 or 30 years after World War II. Now, why do we get a good outcome? Well, there are some macroeconomic reasons. We had stable currency rates. We didn't have the kind of beggar thy neighbor policies that we'd seen in the 1930s. We had a restoration of multilateral settlements, so you didn't have to have barter arrangements between countries. That was a big stimulus. We had a surge in export-led growth. I mean, during that whole Bretton Woods era, when we had these fixed exchange rates and the IMF was really getting going as a big player in the international economy, for the world economy, we had average annual growth in exports of about 9%, and world economic growth was between 5 and 6% for 30 years. It was a period of tremendous export-led growth. And that growth was spread across countries. So the vision that Harry Dexter White had laid out in 1942, that prosperity was, like peace, you had to spread it around the world in order to sustain it. That vision was being realized. And so when the IMF started, right after World War II, the IMF had one creditor country, and that was the United States. They held all the financial assets, basically. By the end of the Bretton Woods era in 1972, there were 17 creditor countries to the IMF, spread across 4 continents. And interestingly enough, none of those 17 countries was the United States, which had gotten into its own problems by the early 70s as a result of mismanaging its own economy. But the point was prosperity was spreading around the world. And then you also had falling inequality within countries. Because there was a period of Keynesian economics. It was a period when governments took responsibility for full employment and not just for finance. And the IMF played a role in all that. The IMF's role was, first of all, to help rebuild the international financial system. It did that. It constituted itself as a forum for discussing these policies so the countries could understand what other countries were doing and promoting currency convertibility. The IMF was lending to countries that had payments deficits. Interestingly enough, not lending so much to very poor countries in those days. The United Kingdom was the biggest borrower from the IMF until 1982, when Mexico became the biggest borrower. And then in the late 1960s, the IMF played a big role in trying to keep the system from totally collapsing. It didn't keep the fixed exchange rate system from collapsing, but it did keep the economy growing through a number of actions. So that was the first model. Focus on macroeconomics, get the economies growing, get the world economy growing, everybody's a little bit better off. Okay, that gets you so far. Now in the 1970s, things began to evolve. The world became a much more complicated place. It became a much more complicated place in I'll mention 3 ways. First of all, there was so much financial turmoil once the countries stopped having fixed exchange rates. You started getting a lot more competition among countries, and that led to a lot of turmoil, which led to a lot more demand for help from the IMF. Secondly, the IMF was getting a lot of new low-income countries. A lot of this came about because of the gradual ending of European colonialism. So that starting in 1957, when Ghana became independent from the United Kingdom and became a member of the IMF, but mainly in the 1970s, 60s through the 70s, almost every country in sub-Saharan Africa became a member of the IMF. Today, every country in Africa is a member of the IMF. And that created huge new challenges for the institution because you couldn't focus just on macro. That was not the big problem anymore. If you were going to help those countries, you needed to dig more deeply into the economic structure of these countries, and that was hard. And nobody, I think, is going to pretend that it was handled particularly well at the outset. Thirdly, you had these huge oil shocks, and the oil shocks created a huge issue because it meant that the oil exporting countries, largely in the Middle East, but also elsewhere, were getting a huge increase in wealth, and oil importing countries were getting a huge decrease in wealth, and that meant that a lot of those assets that were moving from one side of the world to another had to move back, or else the world economy was going to stagnate. And so recycling these, what were called petrodollars in that era, became another big challenge for the IMF. So that led to a whole second model. We're now getting beyond macroeconomics. We're getting into the era of concessional lending on concessional terms, low interest, longer term loans to low income countries, so that they could then begin to share in this prosperity that had already become a major facet of the world economy in richer countries. So the IMF did a lot of things starting around 1975. For the first time, they had a subsidy account. So what they were doing, they set up these oil facilities so that they would take money that they had from oil exporting countries, and they were going to turn around and lend it to oil importing countries. But what do you do if those oil importing countries can't afford to borrow? So they took donations from richer countries, and they used that to subsidize loans to low-income countries. And there are several $100 million worth of loans that were subsidized that way. They set up a trust fund by selling part of the IMF's massive stock of gold, so that they can make longer-term, very low-interest loans to low-income countries. Although today everybody gets a low-interest rate loan, right? Because interest rates are zero every place. But in those days, you could borrow at 0.5% for 10 years. That was pretty good. Now I can borrow at 0.5% for 10 years. But that was a big issue. They set up special facilities in the 1980s. The Structural Adjustment Facility, and then they tripled the size of that and called it the Enhanced Structural Adjustment Facility. And then they renamed it and refocused it in 1999, so that now all these things kind of led up to what we have today, which is called the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust, which is becoming, the IMF will now have a self-sustaining, self-financed, permanent facility for the first time to make grants and very low interest loans to very poor countries, and it now has almost $9 billion in outstanding loans to low income countries. There are 58 low income countries that have borrowed on these very favorable terms from the IMF. Some of them at zero interest. Now, to put that into perspective. The largest borrower under this trust fund is Cote d'Ivoire, which has about $975 million in outstanding loans. That's about 3% of Cote d'Ivoire's GDP. So that's a big loan, right? It's a significant part of international financing for growth in Cote d'Ivoire. Greece, on the other hand, has over $24 billion in outstanding loans from the IMF, and that's about 10% of GDP in Greece. Now, I'm not suggesting that Cote d'Ivoire should borrow 10% of its GDP from the IMF, because that would probably be destabilizing by itself. But you have to keep these things in perspective, that the IMF's main job, its main financial task, is still solving financial crises and trying to keep the world economy going. But what it's doing in low-income countries is not insignificant. Okay, there are other things. The HIPC initiative, which was a debt relief initiative, and then its successor, what we call the MDRI, or from relief of multilateral debt relief, is also important. And just very quickly, I want to mention Sdr allocations, because this has come back into the discussion in a big way now, because we have a lot more of these things outstanding. It's a very technical, nerdy kind of topic, SDRs. But in essence, what these are lines of credit that countries can draw on. And since 1981, countries have been able to draw on them permanently without having to pay them back, as long as they just continue to pay interest at the SDR interest rate, which is a market-based interest rate. So this by itself, these lines of credit are an extra source of resources to low-income countries. And there's no policy conditionality on these things. These are available to every country unconditionally. So that's a big thing that tends to get lost in a lot of these discussions. Okay, so all these things, this has been going on since the mid-1970s. So the second model was moving beyond macro to making loans available on longer term and at lower interest rates to these countries. Then by the 1990s, we got into what I call the third model, which is targeted conditions on loans. So now, instead of just trying to deal with inequality in the sense that you have poor countries that you're trying to help, we're now trying to move into something even more complicated, which is inequality within countries. Right? It's a separate problem altogether, and it's not just low-income countries. It means that if you have a country that has a big inequality problem, and they need to borrow from the IMF is now going to say, it is in your interests, and we are going to try to help you to do this. It is in your interest to try to reduce this excessive inequality within your country. Okay, so that could be Brazil, which is not a low-income country, it's a middle-income developing country, or it could be Cote d'Ivoire, it could be Equatorial Guinea, it could be any country that's borrowing from the IMF. So until 1990 or so, the IMF did not want to get involved in these structural conditions. They wanted just to say, okay, if you get your house in order in terms of stable financing, then we will help you as best we can to improve your economy. Now they're saying, we're going to get into the nitty-gritty. We're going to try to help you reform your policies. Now, this was a problem because it had to be done. But was the IMF really well equipped to do it? That was the question, right? There's all of us macroeconomists there trying to get our hands dirty, going to these countries and saying, we know better than you do. I don't think so, how to reform your economy. So we really had about a 10-year period when there was a struggle going on where the IMF was trying to say, we're trying to help. And these countries are saying, no, you're not helping. You're the problem because we know how to reform our economies. But did they? You know, these are countries that aren't functioning very well. These are economies with huge problems. So you've got problems on both sides, is what I'm trying to say. It was a very hard problem that they were trying to solve. You had when the IMF stayed out of the issue and thus the IMF would say, okay, for financial stability, you need to reduce spending. But it's up to you, the government, to decide where to cut spending. And then the government would say, well, we'll raise bread prices. Okay, and then the poor can't afford to buy bread. And everybody says, oh my God, we're borrowing from the IMF and they're raising bread prices. Let's go out and riot against the IMF. The IMF wasn't telling Egypt or whoever to raise bread prices, but they were saying you need to cut, and they had to cut somewhere. So when we get into the 1990s, the IMF is trying a different model. They're saying you can't raise bread prices because that's going to generate riots and people are going to get killed in the streets. You have to do something else, right? Well, something else might be things that are going to undermine the authority of the government, right? It might be cutting subsidies for imports of the kinds of goods that people who support dictatorial governments want to buy, right? So you get problems with it when you try to stay out of it. You get problems when you try to stay in, when you try to get in too deeply. So we had a whole decade of trying to solve these problems. And by the end of the 1990s, with all the things that the IMF was trying to do to make things better, it had helped some, but I think the reputation of the IMF was suffering because it was getting in way over its head. It was getting in too deeply into trying to define and dictate the kinds of structural reforms that countries should implement. So the problems, just to summarize that, one was that the IMF wasn't very good at it. Another one, and this was something that Pietro alluded to in his introduction, that if the IMF gets too deeply involved, it undercuts domestic policy making, it undercuts domestic ownership of its own policies. And then thirdly, there was a lack of commitment on both sides. There was a lack of commitment on the IMF because so many of the staff didn't think that the IMF should be doing these things, and they knew they weren't very good at it, and there was a lack of commitment on the governments because they didn't want to do these things either. So the third model had to be scrapped, and we got a fourth model. And the fourth model, which is the one that's been in effect for the last 15 years or so, is a model in which the IMF has said, let's focus on the most critical kinds of reforms, not try to get into all the reforms that countries need to make. Let's try to streamline and cut down on the number of conditions on our loans. Let's leave other problems to the World Bank. Let's leave some problems to the UN. Let's leave some problems to the country. And that gets back, I showed you that quote early on in this talk from Horst Köhler when he says we want a country-led process, right? That's the fourth model. It's saying we're not going to helicopter into these countries and tell them what to do. We're going to fly in, we're going to ask these countries what they think needs to be done, and then we're going to talk about it. We're not going to just arrive in the country with a program all written out in Washington. We're going to try to work with the country to define a program that's going to work for that country. That's the theory. That's the fourth model. That's where we are now. And so one thing is limiting the number of conditions to those that are most critical. A second thing is focusing more on advice than on conditions, so that the country is more in the lead in deciding, but also having a special focus, particularly in the poorest countries, on the harm. And as part of this dialogue, let's have a focus in the dialogue on the harm that's being done from excessive inequality, which is a huge problem in so many of these countries. And thirdly, and this has been a big change from the 1990s and these earlier models, that the IMF has taken a more proactive role in encouraging donors to scale up aid. I remember many discussions when I worked at the IMF where the question of scaling up aid was problematic because so many macroeconomic studies had shown that there was a limited ability in poor countries to absorb aid, and that if you had too much aid coming in too quickly, you'd have corruption that would be magnified, you'd have inflation that would result, it would benefit the elites in these countries and not the broad population, and so on. And so the idea was that aid had to be scaled up slowly and gradually, and there were cases where donors wanted to provide more aid to countries, and the IMF was discouraging them from doing so because they thought it would do more harm than good. That I don't think is happening anymore, because under this new model, the IMF is working with the countries to try to help them absorb aid more positively, and they're working with donors to say, here are cases where more aid can be used and has to be forthcoming. So that's a big part of the fourth model. And then the last part of it is to defer more to other agencies, whether it's the World Bank or donors or the United Nations or whatever. This is something, when you're outside Washington, you look at the IMF and the World Bank and they look very similar. When you're inside, they look totally opposites. And so for the IMF and the World Bank to try to work better together is a very hard problem, but I think they are making some progress. Okay, so just to wrap this up, we've had these four models. The fourth model, I think, is demonstrably working a lot better than the first three models. It's been a result of a lot of soul searching, experimentation, trying to find what works and what doesn't work, and it's working better. But what do we need to make it work better? How do we go above marginal positive contribution to poverty reduction? And I think what is most needed is improved governance of the international financial system. We have a lot of problems in governance of the system. And that has resulted in a breakdown of trust between the institutions that are trying to help and the countries that they are trying to help. The IMF's reputation suffered a lot as a result of problems with the third model, and that breakdown in trust, I think, is still there in many countries. And so trying to build trust, I'll say a little bit in a couple of minutes about more about what I mean by that. The second thing, though, is just trying to have a better dialogue and rebuild trust, is that we have a silo structure. The IMF was set up to focus on finance. The World Bank was set up to focus on development, on project financing. And we have other institutions that all have specialized roles. There's no really good overall guidance to what these institutions are doing, and we need to solve that problem. And I will argue that I think that the G20, for all of its strengths, has become part of the problem because it's not broad enough to serve the purpose of breaking down this silo structure. And then lastly, and this relates to these other two issues, is we have to ensure that low-income countries and other developing countries have adequate voice and representation in the governance of the system. It cannot just be a top-down system from the top, which is the way it was created and the way it's worked over many years. So let me just finish by saying a little bit about these two issues, voice and representation, and then breaking down the silo structure. There's the IMF, most of the voting power in the IMF is based on how big a country's economy is. So the bigger the country, the more votes it has. But in order to soften that a little bit, each country has what's called a certain number of basic votes. And the decision was made at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 that 11% of the total voting power in the IMF should be made up of these basic votes. And that made sure that every country that was a member of the IMF had a meaningful vote. And so 11% was in basic votes. But they made a mistake because they didn't realize how fast the world economy was going to grow after World War II. So the bigger the world economy got, each country had a fixed number of basic votes. So the total votes kept going up and the basic votes stayed the same. So by a decade ago, in the middle of the last decade, basic votes were worth only about 1% of total votes. So the small countries had no representation effectively whatsoever. And so then they tried to reverse this process. And so they amended the Articles of Agreement of the IMF to bring it back up to 5.5%. So the good news is that it's now a fixed percentage. So it'll always be 5.5%. The bad news is 5.5% is only half of 11%. They should have gone back to 11% in my personal opinion. But so there's a recognition that there's a problem with voice and representation of small countries and poor countries, but it's not fully being solved. And sub-Saharan Africa is the region that is most vulnerable here. So the last point I really want to make, I had some notes about the SDR, but let me skip over that because I just want to say this about the G20. It used to be, in the 1990s, we had a group called the G7 that was the major group that dealt with representing the rich countries in discussing international finance. And then there was another group, the G24, which represented developing countries. So the G7 would say, this is what we want to see happen. And the G24 would say, no, this is what we want to see happen. And then they would come together at the IMF, and the IMF would serve as the institution that would reconcile the views of rich and poor countries and try to come up with a consensus that everybody could live with. Now what do we have? The G20 comes into being, and the G20 is 20 countries, but it's 20 countries that represent about 80% of world trade, and they control 77% of the voting power in the IMF. So the G20 makes a pronouncement, and then it goes to the IMF, and they say, gee, that sounds like a good idea. I think we should do that, and we'll carry that out. So what's that? What crumbs are left for small countries and poor countries? Virtually nothing, right? So I made this argument at the IMF, and I got shouted down by the managing director, but she's not here today, so I'll keep making this argument because I think it's very important to recognize that small countries and poor countries have been shut out of the discussion because of the G20. And that's not an indictment of the G20, it's an indictment of the system within which the G20 works. There's no effective counterweight to the G20, and that's one of the things I think that we really need in order to make sure that we have a really positive way of moving forward with these problems. So that's these are my main conclusions. I had some thoughts about reconstituting the G20, but I'll just say to repeat what I said at the outset, global inequality, reducing it is an avowed goal of the IMF. It's made some progress, but it needs to do more. It needs to have an even greater commitment to implementing recent reforms, and then we need governance reforms from the international community. So, thank you very much.
Grazie davvero James Boughton per questa ricognizione storica.
Thank you very much, Mr. Boughton, for this historical analysis. You've taken us through the history of the fund at different times. I don't know whether the audience agrees with me, but it seems like the fund became, the IMF became ever smoother, democratic, and perhaps even human. And there's a fifth model, perhaps, looming ahead, which should be based on trust. Well, even the very word conditionality, and probably Mr. Boughton corrected me, because in the fourth model, the one that has been with us for the last 15 years, well, the word the conditionality in the fourth model was replaced by advice. Now, having said this much, I think that we can take your questions if you have any. There's a roving mic available, and in the meantime, I'd like to ask one question myself on this historical presentation. I'd like to talk about the democratic decision-making process when it comes to global decisions. There's a program that I hold here at the Radio 3, the national radio, and there was economist Danny Roderick that presented us the content of his latest book, International Globalization, and he refers to the trilemma, so a dilemma with three horns. Roderick basically says that this world sees three main actions: economic globalization, political democratization, and nation states or national sovereignty. Well, the three things together cannot be. So a decision has to be made whereby two things exist. Either we have a supranational power, or if you'd rather have national sovereignty, if there's no will to yield this national sovereignty, and as a matter of fact, this is proving to be pretty difficult in Europe, then we have to be happy with without some degree of democracy. So there should be that divorce that was referred to also by Bauman of true power and politics, where national states are being unable to make decisions and international agency making the most important decisions. I'm not just referring to the IMF, but the G20, for example, that together with other agencies make decisions that perhaps are not legitimate by a vote, a democratic vote. At this very festival, also Martin Wolf, journalist of the Financial Times, says something similar in that he refers to a divorce, to a distinction between power and accountability, so that whereby true decisions basically are made worldwide by people that are not held accountable before the public, that are not actually voted by voters, that have to bear with the decisions that they make. So this is either a dilemma or a trilemma, as Roderick says. And perhaps the fifth model of the IMF seems to react to that. It seems to give new voice to the power in small countries. Is it going to be enough, you think? Mr. Boughton, do you think this problem is true? Is there a true distinction between the power governing the economics and the power of democracy as legitimated by voters? Do you think that there is such distinction?
I think it is a problem, and there's. Let's be concrete about it. Let's talk about China. I mean, China has been one of the most rapidly growing economies in the world for the last 20 years, and it is underrepresented in the IMF. Now, it's underrepresented by two standards. First of all, it's the most populous country in the world with, 1.3 billion people. But secondly, it is now the second largest economy in the world, measured by output. So by either standard, one would argue that the that China should have a larger voting share than it currently has. But I think there's a problem with the population argument, because we then have to peel off another layer of the question and ask, to what extent do the policies of the Chinese government represent the democratic wishes of the Chinese people? Now, I don't want to make a dogmatic answer to that. I think it's a very complicated question. But I think it's different in a country like China from in other countries that may have different democratic traditions. So there's been a lot of debate over the years about the technical term is putting population in the quota formula, which would mean that more populous countries would have more votes. But I do think there's a logical problem with doing that. Now, fortunately, in the case of China, we no longer need to ask that question, because China obviously deserves a much higher voting share, simply because of its the size of its economy. So I think these debates will continue to go on, but as long as the unit of voting in the IMF is the nation state, then there's a conflict between the way we normally think about democratic principles, where the unit is the individual or the family, and democracy in governing the international system, where the unit is the state. It's a very different kind of meaning of democracy. So,
tocca al signore in seconda fila.
Grazie. Il professor Broughton ha citato le ultime parole della Cina.
You talked about China. If I may, I would like to also spend a few words about that, because in the fifth model, the gentleman says, you presented the future of the activity of the fund in the interest of the poorer countries, more so than in the past. But I ask you this. The fact that China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, the biggest economies now, and they are certainly the players of the economic settings. How can we accommodate that with the fact that they do not actually have power in terms of the financial structure of the world? Do you think that this situation can last? Because the governor of the Chinese central bank, until before the crisis, insisted on the problem of having a model which was not correct, and it was the model based on the dollar economy. And he voiced for a change in the monetary structure of international relations. And this thing has been momentarily set aside. So I would like to ask you whether this is going to be the issue we will have to tackle, more so than aid to poor countries.
Yeah. It's an excellent question, and I think it's a problem that people are trying to solve. I agree completely with the premise, if I understand the premise of your question, which is that we have the BRICS that are China and Russia and India and Brazil and South Africa now being included in that group. They're very rapidly growing countries that are still underrepresented. Now, there was a major reform package that was approved overwhelmingly by the Board of Governors of the IMF in 2010, 5 years ago. And it's been ratified by almost all the countries that need to ratify it in order to put it into effect. But it's being blocked by one body that happens to be the most dysfunctional political body in the world today, and that's the U.S. Congress. And it's not being blocked because a majority of the U.S. Congress thinks it's a bad idea. It's being blocked because a majority of the majority party in the U.S. Congress doesn't want to do anything that would help the president. So it's a completely dysfunctional situation where a major reform that is essential to improving the governance of the system is not happening because of a problem in governance of the U.S. And so, but I think it will happen, and I agree that it has to happen. Now, the second part of your question about Governor Joe's proposal on moving beyond a dollar-based system. Effectively, what he called for is very similar to proposals that have been raised over the years, going back to the early 70s, for what's called a substitution account in the IMF. And that would be, suppose you have countries that are holding a lot more dollars in their international reserves than they really want to hold. Let's say they're holding 80% of their reserves in the form of dollars because that's the currency that they happen to receive for their exports. But they would like to wind this down, but they have a problem, particularly if you're a huge country like China. You have a problem because if you start selling off dollars, then the value of the dollar goes down, and then you've undercut the value of your own dollar holdings, and so nobody wants to do this. So what he wants is a system where you could replace these dollars with a broader currency basket. That might be the SDR, it might be another basket, but it would be something that would be more stable, and you could switch out of dollars and into this basket without going through the market, without destabilizing the markets. So that's what he wanted to do. It's an old proposal, but it gave it new urgency by raising it. And I don't think it's a dead proposal. I don't think it's something that people have just said, no, we're not going to consider that. But it can only work if it has the support of the U.S. government. And that gets us back to this other problem, that if I had a way to solve the dysfunctionality of the U.S. Congress, believe me, I would do it today. But I think that's a problem that will eventually diminish, but it's not going to diminish tomorrow. So you raised important problems. I think people are aware of the problems, but I think we're all just going to have to be patient before we see them being solved.
Altre domande? Allora, una mano a quella ragazza che... Poi dunque si sono prenotati, raccogliamone dopo la ragazza che sta per parlare, direi...
We collect a number of questions. How many hands have been raised? 1, 2, 3. So we collect 3 questions.
Dalla ragazza con la camicia bianca.
I have a very brief comment about the new development bankers. Do you think it could be a threat to the International Monetary Fund today?
Okay. So,
Do you want to collect more questions?
yeah, I thought if we collected a few, sure.
Allora,
io volevo restare sulla Cina e volevo sapere
I would
cosa
like
pensa
to ask something about China. What do you think about the Asian Bank for Investment in Infrastructures? People don't speak about that much, but people say that it will soon be ready to operate and that it has been set up to counter, in a way, or act as a counterbalance to the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, and it has been set up by China. So I would like to know what you think about it. And I would like to know from you whether would you please start again? I would like to ask you whether the birth and creation of the United States of Europe, as they are called, might be a solution for and to the crisis of the Eurozone. There is a last question up there. So let's take 5 now, 5 questions, otherwise it becomes too much.
La mia domanda è, volevo chiedere cosa sta facendo, cosa ha fatto e cosa sta facendo il sistema monetario del fondo.
What is the International Monetary Fund doing with reference to the shadow system banks, to the shadow banks?
Accolto il senso della domanda, mi pare tutto. Questa ragazza in seconda fila e poi chiudiamo.
A last question here.
La raccolta delle domande.
And then Professor Boughton will have the hard task to answer all these questions. I would like to have a comment on the situation of Greece. What is the Monetary Fund thinking? Because it has already reviewed its position in a way, the situation is very complex. What do you think has not worked, and what aspects of these models made the Greek model as something which is a very critical element and highlights a number of criticalities in the Monetary Fund itself?
Okay, thanks very much. These are all good questions. The first two questions both have to do with these new regional development banks. There's, I mean, the one that's the most recent one, of course, is the one that China's been setting up, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. But there are others, the new BRICS Bank that was set up last year and so on. I think the real question that people are struggling with is to understand whether these are a threat to the established order. And my own view on that is that they're a threat to the established order only if people think of the established order as preserving the interests of the old powers. I don't think they're necessarily a threat to the global institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, because I think in an ideal international system, we would have global oversight by all the major powers, and then we would have institutions, there would be global institutions dealing with a whole range of problems, where the purpose of this oversight group would be to make sure that there's coordination among agencies, so that the IMF and the World Bank aren't working at cross purposes, for example. And then you'd have regional institutions that would help implement that, provide additional financing, and also that would provide effective feedback on what the interests and problems are in each region. So I think if you set up a regional development bank or a regional financing mechanism like the Chiang Mai Initiative in Southeast Asia, that as long as that is linked to the global process, then it serves a positive purpose. If instead it is set up, if these regional institutions are set up as competitors that are designed to undermine the global institutions, then we have a problem that can be solved maybe by reforming the global institutions so that they work more in the regional interests, or by somehow putting the regional institutions in a proper place within the global system. So we're in very early stages of trying to figure out how this is all going to play out. But I think everybody should be encouraged by the fact that China has brought together all these countries with all this money to help finance infrastructure development across Asia. I mean, how can that be a bad thing? So I think it'll take some time, but I think it'll be a positive development. Then we had a couple of more specific questions about the EU. I mean, I'm not sure I fully understood the thinking behind that question, but I think it should be clear to everybody by now that there's a gap in the governance of the European Union, that there's no fiscal process to match the monetary process. And until you have a real political integration that would create something like a United States of Europe, then you're going to continue to have these kinds of gaps that are going to result in periodic crises. I think it's worth remembering that in the United States, it took about 100 years and a civil war before people really began to think of themselves as Americans first and Georgians second. People still think of themselves as Texans first, but that's another story. So I think that'll take a long time. Shadow banks are something that are being studied a lot. Shadow banks, again, are not a new problem. you set up these rules that to have a stable financial system focused on banks. Banks are incredibly important because they're the payment system. And if the banking system collapses, then payments collapse, and you're back to barter in the Great Depression, right? I mean, you can't have a functioning modern economy without a functioning banking system. But if you regulate the banking system and you don't regulate other institutions that are very similar, then you're going to have similar kinds of problems, particularly if you have interlinkages between the banks and the shadow banks. We don't, again, I hope I'm not repeating myself too much, but you're raising very hard problems that I think all you can really say is that people are aware of that they are problems, but I think we also have to be aware that we can't solve them overnight. And that brings back the elephant in the room, Greece. Greece is the problem in the world economy right now. And the question that was raised, and I think it's the right question, is what is the IMF thinking? Now, I've been out of the IMF for the past 3 years, so I can't speak other than from anecdotal evidence, talking to people around Washington, as to what the real thinking is. Let me say this about it, though, that I think the IMF made a major mistake in letting itself get trapped into the Troika in the way that it did. Because the nature of the Troika was that you had three institutions. You had the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the IMF. The proper role of each of those institutions was very well understood at the outset. And that was that the IMF is to look after the global interest and to look after the interests of the Greek economy and the Greek people. The role of the IMF was to solve the Greek crisis, right? And it had the resources and it had the authority to determine the kinds of policy changes that Greece would need to make, the kinds of debt restructuring that might be needed, and the extent of debt restructuring that might be needed. But if the IMF had asserted itself in the way that would have been expected under normal conditions, the Europeans would not have liked the answers, right? Because the costs that particularly the debt restructuring would have imposed on Europe in 2009, 2010, 2011 would be huge. And even today, if we have further debt restructuring in Greece, who's going to bear the brunt of the burden of that? It's the Greek institutions that hold the majority of the Greek debt. So what we had instead was a situation that was dictated from Europe, which was that you'd have the three institutions, all nice friendly parties to it, that would all get together, and then they agreed at the outset that they would argue and debate within the Troika, and they would reach a majority view, and once they had a majority view, everybody would be on board and support that view. Well, who holds the majority in the Troika? It's not the IMF, right? So they got themselves into a situation where they were trapped from the very beginning into simply buying into the European view. But the Europeans are not out for the global welfare. They're not out for the Greek welfare. They're out for the European welfare. They're out to save the euro, right? Now, saving the euro may be a very worthwhile goal for Europe, but it's not in the IMF's interest to save the euro unless saving the euro is in the global interest. And that's what I think got lost. Now, I think a lot of people are coming around to this conclusion now. And so to get back to the way you raised the question, what is the IMF thinking about it? I think the IMF is looking for ways out of it. But in 2015, trying to come up with a good solution is almost impossible because the costs are now so concentrated and the solution is so difficult and the parties within Europe are so far apart that I think if you were to pass around sheets of paper around this room and say, how do we get out of this? We'd have how many people are here? We'd have 100 unworkable answers, each one of which would be beautifully constructed, but would never actually get enacted. It's just a very hard problem. But I think people are aware that they've gotten themselves into a very big mess.
Su queste parole ritengo molto interessanti.
Well, your words have been extremely interesting. Thank you for what you said also about Greece and the role of the International Monetary Fund. We close here. Thank you so much. Thanks to Professor Boughton. Thank you. Thanks to you all.
We always think we can cover more stuff than we can.